Hello there, students. Today we are going to talk about political ideology and how the Electoral College works. For your first flipped assignment, if you would draw a chart that looks like this, and then just describe each ideology as we go through it in the PowerPoint. So radicals, as far as political ideology goes, want rapid change, are supportive of violence if necessary. They're the people that would be supportive of violent protests. So it's a very small percentage of ideologies, but they are on the spectrum. Liberals want the government to be active in supporting civil rights, individual welfare, and they tend to be more in favor of peaceful change within the existing systems. So I think they get confused with radicals a lot, but they are not the same. Moderates tend to be tolerant of others' opinions, not likely to hold extreme views, and moderates can be both liberal and conservative. I think there's more of a trend for people in the United States that are slightly more liberal to refer to themselves as moderate, just because we're a pretty conservative / moderate society. And the term liberal is often viewed negatively. And then there's the conservative ideology. They prefer a limited government role in helping individuals economically, traditional values and lifestyles, active government and national security, but really that's usually it. And they're very cautious about change. And then at the other end of the spectrum is reactionaries. These are people who want to return to a previous state of affairs, the people who tend to be like nostalgic for the 50s or whatever. And like the radicals, they're willing to resort to extreme measures, sometimes violence if necessary, to take things back to how they once were. So who are the liberals and conservatives? Well, currently, according to the latest Pew information from 2014, about 38% of people in the United States identify as conservative, 24 identify as liberal, and 38 identify as moderate. There's the gender gap that we've talked about several times. Women tend to be less conservative than men. And there is some ideological variation based on religion, too. Jewish people tend to be more liberal. Hindus tend to be more conservative. Catholics tend to split on social issues as far as ideology goes. All right, and then here's a chart. It's from your textbook on how to tell a liberal from conservative. You've got foreign policy. Liberals obviously believe we should spend less. Conservatives believe we should spend more because we have to maintain our strength and support around the world. Social policy. Liberals tend to support freedom of choice. For abortion, they're opposed to prayer in school and favor affirmative action. And conservatives, of course, are the opposite of that. Right to life, supportive of prayer in schools, and oppose affirmative action. Economic policy, as far as the scope of the government, liberals view the government as a regulator in public interest. Therefore, it's something that needs to be, bigger and have more regulatory power over businesses and institutions. Conservatives tend to favor free market solutions. Liberals want to tax the rich more and want to spend more on the poor. Conservatives want to keep taxes low and keep spending low. Liberals, as far as crime goes, believe that we should solve problems that cause crime. And that as far as defendants go, we should guard their rights very carefully. Conservatives tend to believe that we should stop coddling criminals and that we should stop letting criminals hide behind the law and just, put them in jail or execute them or whatever the case may be. Alright, so do people think in ideological terms? No. When people are voting, only about 12% of the population tend to pick the party or the person that they vote for based on ideological terms. Only about 12%. 42% of voters vote through what's called group benefit. They view politics through a party label. So it tends to be the people that are like, well, my daddy has voted Republican and his daddy before him voted Republican, so I'm just going to keep doing that because they know the party label. They're not necessarily familiar with what's going on in that election cycle. I mean, they may be, but usually it's just that they're voting based on the label. There's the nature of the Times voters. Those are people who view politics based on whether the times are good or bad. So these tend to be more reactionary type voters. 24% of voters vote this way. Well, you know, the economy really sucks right now, so I'm just going to vote for the other party this time. And then there's no issue content voters. These are voters who vote routinely for party or personality. That's 22% of the voting population, usually. Whoever's personality is the biggest, whatever party is the shiniest, that sort of thing. Alright, so there are 3 types of elections. There are primary and general, and then there are specific policy elections. Primary elections are the first type, and that's where parties select the nominee that will go on to the general election. The general elections select office holders at all levels of government. And then specific policies, there's referendums and initiative petitions. Different states have different versions of these. North Carolina doesn't actually have either, though we have been known to, at least once in our history, add an amendment, but that technically doesn't count as an initiative or a referendum. A referendum is a state-level method of direct legislation that gives voters a chance to approve of proposed legislation or a constitutional amendment. So, a few years ago we passed Amendment 1, and it was close to a referendum vote, but technically our Constitution doesn't say our elections can legally have referendums, so there's kind of an anomaly. But technically, I guess that's what that would be considered, even though it's not North Carolina constitutional. Anyway, and then there's the initiative petition. This is a process permitted in some states where voters can actually propose changes to the state constitution by a vote if they get a sufficient number of signatures on a petition to have it put onto a ballot. So referendums tend to be state government motivated. Initiative petitions tend to be people of that state motivated. Sorry, I'm kind of sick. Alright, primaries and caucuses. States have either primaries or caucuses to decide which party candidate will go into the general election. Most states have primaries, but there are a few that have caucuses. Caucuses are weird. It's a gathering of neighbors to pick a candidate. It's less formal than a primary. The selection is done at a central point in the voting precinct, a church, a school, a library, etc. There are 15 states that use caucuses as a means to nominate delegates to go on to the national conventions. Iowa is always the first and considered the most important of the 15 caucuses in the United States. Basically, the way that caucuses work as a less formal way of voting than a primary is you get a bunch of people into a room in a church or a school or whatever, and you say, okay, here are 2 candidates, and then you make them move to either side of the room based on which candidate they support, and they argue back and forth for a few hours, and then at the end of the argument period, the side of the room with the most people represents the candidate who wins in that particular area. And then this is done at a specific time all across the state, and then the numbers are tallied up, so it's voting physically with your body. Obviously, less people are going to participate in this because you have to be available at a specific time and have a few hours free, which is probably why only 15 states do it. Primaries are more formal. It's an election, an official election held within the party to select the party candidates for all elected offices, state, national, president, etc. The candidate selection used to be controlled entirely by the party, but that changed after the 1960s. I'm going to actually have you guys read an article about that in a little while. More media saturation and longer campaigns have changed the mode of the primaries. We tend to start looking at presidential elections way earlier these days than we used to because of the primaries. The Democratic Party at their convention has superdelegates. The Republican Democratic Convention does not use superdelegates. Superdelegates are not chosen by voters. They're seated automatically because of their status as a party leader, so they tend to be people that are important in the party or people that have important positions in the government, and they can support whoever they want. Republicans don't call them superdelegates. They call them unpledged delegates, and they're not quite the same for Republicans, but they're similar enough. So both parties ultimately have delegates. Those are people that are really loyal to the party that can be picked. And they are usually, in most states, required to vote with the popular vote for the presidential candidate. The superdelegates and the unpledged delegates have a bit more flexibility because of their status within the parties. Right, so there is a video that I have attached to this Google Classroom assignment about how primaries and caucuses work. So as you watch it, it's about 5 minutes long. I just want you to explain the 5 complications of primaries. There are 2 types of primaries, open and closed. The advantages of having an open primary is that it is open to not just people in your party, but also independent voters. So it encourages independent voting. Privacy is ensured. There's a higher turnout for open primaries than closed. Disadvantages: rating is easier. That just means that people that want to sabotage maybe the Democratic Party can coordinate and go in as independent voters and help elect a candidate who is not a good candidate for the general election. Non-party members are selecting party candidates, which can be seen as a disadvantage. We saw a bit of that argument with Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Party during the last election. Closed primaries are closed to anyone who is not registered in that party. Only party members can select the candidates, so that cuts down on rating. It discourages independent voting, though. There's no privacy and there's lower voter turnout. North Carolina has a mixed primary, so some counties have open and some counties have closed. Problems with the system. We tend to pay a disproportionate amount of attention to the early primaries and caucuses. After Super Tuesday, the primaries aren't as important because the media and the candidates have already kind of figured out who's going to win because there is so much emphasis on it in the news. Prominent politicians find it difficult to make time to run. Money plays a huge role. Participation in primaries and caucuses is low and unrepresentative of the American population as a whole, and the system gives a lot of power to the media. Alright, the Electoral College. Oops, go back. The Electoral College actually elects the president, you guys know that. The founders wanted him chosen by the elites of the country, the more educated, the people with stakes in society. States choose the electors, and they're chosen from the party, from the parties. They're, again, people that are loyal to the party, and they're very active in the party. And most states have a winner-take-all system. I believe there are only 2 states that don't have a winner-take-all system. So what that means is that if Donald Trump wins 52% of the electoral votes in North Carolina, he gets to take all 15 of our electoral votes because he has the majority. It's a winner-take-all system. Alright, each representative today has as many votes as, each state has as many votes as its representatives and senators. So, like, for example, we have 15 votes because we have 13 representatives in the House and 2 senators in the Senate at the national level, so we have 15 electoral votes total. The winner of the popular vote typically gets all the Electoral College votes for that state. That's called winner-take-all again. Electors meet in December. This past year they met on December 19th. Votes are reported by the vice president in January. If no candidate gets a majority of votes, which is 270, the House of Representatives gets to pick the president. That has only happened once. You guys remember that from U.S., right? And then this is our last assignment. Just reflect, is the Electoral College a good reflection of democracy? Should it be? Why or why not? I will see you all tomorrow.